Hello and welcome. Here we are at episode number 5 of Fablebreakers, which is pretty cool. Today we're going to be doing things a little bit differently.
This time around, our guest is Scott Fagerlund, a religion and philosophy major who doesn't claim to be a creative person necessarily, but is ready to talk about the purpose of art, the big picture, why we should even bother to create it all. And that's going to be the focus for our discussion today.
My name is Jake Romano.
And I'm Carly Racklin.
And we're here to take the myth out of making something meaningful.
I'm just realizing now, Scott looks like someone that I know of, and I was like, why does he look so familiar? It's because he looks like the guitarist of a band that I really like. They're called Comrades. They're the genre is post-hardcore, but they're just metal. To me, that's basically what they are. But they're a really amazing Christian metal band, but he has red hair and a long beard. I
No,
feel
don't
like I
believe
have
it.
to pull up a picture of this guitarist.
Oh no, go ahead.
Okay, this is the best. I'm gonna have to
Oh my gosh.
I have an Indiana Jones hat, actually.
Oh my
Oh,
god.
man.
Can we gotta get a picture of you with the Indiana Jones hat on, and then we're gonna put them
Oh
side by
my
side.
I feel like that's just it's gonna be a really weird, obscure thing that no one's gonna get, because I don't know anyone except one friend, the friend who introduced me to this band. I don't know anyone who knows them.
It's because you're a hipster, so.
Sure, why not?
Alright, so I think we're sort of ready to start here.
How are we starting?
I don't know, how should we
I was gonna ask about video games, or ask for his credentials.
Let's do that. Okay, so Scott, give us your credentials. Who the heck are you?
Okay, let's see. I just graduated this May from Nyack College. It's this tiny private Christian school associated with the Christian Missionary Alliance. And I majored in religions, so comparative religions. And I minored in philosophy, and I got a minor in Bible, too.
So, you're qualified to talk about stuff.
I would hope so. I always fear that I'm going to mislead people. I always qualify my statements because I'm just that scared of not remembering things correctly.
Well, you don't have to worry about that, because for today we're just going to be... Well, yes, please do worry about that. No, we're going to... Today we're going to be talking about, some pretty, broad, big topics, so I don't think we're going to get to the, to the bottom of, the topic or our theme. We just want to get your opinion, and we want to kind of open up a discussion and have people make up their minds about what they're hearing. The pressure's kind of off. Just give us, kind of your take on things, and we'll kind of take it from there. So, speaking of our theme...
So, Scott, what is art?
Softball questions, yes. Man, that's, like you said, a broad question.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends so much on the medium. There's writing, there's sculpting, there's graphic design, there's paint, there's frescoes, and I think it's easy to think it's just about making things aesthetically pleasing, just pleasing to the eye. But I mean, we treat art with a whole lot more weight and sometimes reverence. I mean, poetry, music, we like to talk like that's the language of the soul. That's, you're representing emotions, not just, dry facts and things like that. There's a lot of communication involved. Maybe I could say it's communicating things that's in a way that's changes not just your mind, but your heart, or really goes for your heart. So
I'm glad you brought up the changing the hearts and minds kind of thing, because we talked about that with Amy, our last guest, in our previous episode, about how art can be compelling and can compel us to do certain things, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but we wanted to ask that to kind of lay a little bit of ground rules. Again, I know it's broad, but because before we even start, just a little bit, right? Before we even start talking about the purpose of art, we want to try to understand a little bit what art is. And yeah, it's kind of nebulous. There's a lot of communication, there's emotion. I like what you said about how art is kind of the language of the soul. I think probably communication is a really big part of art. So that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
And that's interesting, the idea of art as the communication of the soul and all that. It presents this idea of it as a kind of sacred concept. And you also brought up the idea that it's aesthetically pleasing. And I feel like there's some argument over, like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So some things people consider to be art and other people don't consider those things to be art because it is aesthetically pleasing to someone but ugly to another person. And I can't help but think of modern art and how controversial those things are. I don't know if you know Marcel Duchamp, his sculpture that's a urinal, and those concepts. And some people will argue like that's not art, it's so stupid, and other people will argue that it is and it's some kind of social commentary. I can't help but think that maybe it has something to do with the reaction it inspires in the audience and that argument of whether or not it is meaningful in some way, and maybe that's the whole purpose of it. I liked what you said though about communicating through impressions. And I think that can kind of be tied back to what I just said about art maybe being more about inspiring reactions in people. But yeah, I don't know, the notion hanging over this entire episode is the idea that we're just going to kind of pull ideas out of the air and try to explain these really difficult, complex concepts. And we've kind of just accepted that we might not be able to ever pin any of them down. And I think it's because this whole concept of art and meaning and creation is really, I don't know, can be kind of metaphysical and difficult to grasp for anyone who's dealing with it.
Definitely.
And everyone has a different experience with art too. So it probably, really does mean different things to different people. But there are probably some universals that we can kind of grasp at and talk about a little bit too. And I think probably that audience-artist relationship kind of thing is one of those universals. So yeah, it's going to be tough to pin down, but we'll do our best.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this last night because I remembered being asked in one of my writing classes in college. One of my professors posed the question to us to define what is art. And I don't remember exactly what I wrote down, but I think it had something to do with being a created thing that's meant to inspire emotions or some kind of reaction in a viewer. And I asked myself looking back, well, what's the difference between that and something else that I wouldn't consider art? And I thought of like an advertisement on TV, which is a created thing that uses kind of characters and scenarios to change a viewer's mind. How is that, if that's my definition of art, but I don't consider an advertisement art, like that's complicated? And then how is
that's
that
disappointing because I create advertisements all day for my job.
Yeah.
So, sorry, go ahead.
You're inspiring reactions, just the reaction is to buy something.
Yeah.
And that was more just something that made me think that maybe my preconceived notion about the definition of art is not as clear cut as I thought it was. How then is a book different from this advertisement? If they both use characters and scenarios to change people's minds, why do we think that the book is inherently more valuable than the advertisement?
I do kind of have an answer for that, and I think part of it is money. Money is kind of the difference because an advertiser usually wants the audience's money, whereas as opposed to maybe a writer or an artist, they want their audience to feel the emotion that they get from that they inspire in the audience is an end in itself usually, whereas when someone's advertising, usually it's money is the end.
Yeah, the message is different. Yeah, you're not just buying something, you're trying to inspire people to either like be a better person or to, get along with some movement or something like that. You're not we could say that it is art, but it's an abuse of art, or it's just not as good a use of art. Like I mentioned, like something called like artistic or sophistic artistry. I just kind of put the two words together, but like the sophists were these group of people in ancient Greece where they were like, we don't really care about truth. We're just getting people we're teaching them how to win arguments and win people over. It doesn't matter whether something is true or not, or virtuous or not. It's just we're just buy this, follow this politician or whatever. So that made the philosophers kind of mad because by definition they really like truth. They really trying to get at it. But
So they were kind of advertisers, right? Is that what I mean? Like that's kind of where that.
well, I mean, it would like teach them to learn how to win a crowd, whether they get people like you, get people to follow you, whether you're a good person or not.
Mm-hmm.
So you said they didn't care whether art was virtuous or not art, but if something they made was virtuous or not. So then do you think the purpose of art or art should be virtuous to be art? Is that one of the things on the checklist that makes something art, is if it's virtuous or in the pursuit of virtue?
Well, I would like to think so, but I can't help but think that it's just an abuse of art. Like that's why we dislike it, is that we're abusing it. Like it should be being used for something better, but
Well, maybe then we could say that good art is virtuous or is truthful. Maybe we can't say what is art or not, but maybe we can lean more towards if it's saying something true, then it's like better art maybe, as opposed to like abusing it, or using it for ourselves.
It depends on how you would answer different questions, like is there a God? Is there what are we just like passing on good ideas? Are we just doing that, or are we just is it just the law of the jungle, or are we really held responsible by an eternal being, whether that be Jesus, whether that be Allah? So I think that how you answer those questions is definitely going to affect how you answer like how art should be used.
Well, some people say that like our need to create as humans is a reflection of God's own love for well-designed things and for beauty, and that nature is kind of like the ultimate standard for beauty. It's the ultimate art piece. Do you think there's any truth to that, and that like when we create, that need to create is kind of a reflection of that, and to kind of reflect nature and the beauty in nature and how well-designed nature is?
I think so, because Christians would say that we're made in the image of God. I'm a Christian, so I would say we're made in the image of God, and that means not necessarily that we just like, hey, look, God looks like a human. I mean, he did because he came as Jesus, but he like image of God is more like your will, your emotions, and things like that. So, like God is all knowing. We know some things. We know a little bit. So we're reflecting God's image in that way. So I think definitely in terms of his creativity, that's where it comes from, because we are ultimately found our source in God. That's where our origin's from.
That's cool. I like that.
And there is something about, I know there's a verse that I'm not going to be able to pull it out of thin air here, but in a way that when we look at nature, we see God in that, or not that God lives in grass and trees, but we see him in those things. And is it
the verse that's like all creation points to the glory of God?
I think so. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The heavens declare the glory of God.
Yeah.
The skies proclaim the work of his hands.
I mean, there are a couple verses that refer to God in terms of like artistic things. There's the verse about the potter and the clay.
Mm-hmm.
And remember that God himself gave to, if you desire to read that section of Exodus where God like totally lays out like every aspect of the tabernacle, like he's giving specific details about how that thing should be made. I mean, God himself ordered these skilled craftsmen to make this, and he gave them the blueprints for this thing. So obviously he cares about, making things well, making it according to a plan. There's an order to it, but there's creativity to it, I'm guessing.
I definitely agree with that idea, that it seems like kind of what we're hinting at here is that God desires us to make good works of art. It relates to what we talked about with Amy in the last episode, and there's a quote from someone, I can't remember who it is, but something about like the Christian shoemaker doesn't put crosses into all the shoes he makes. He just makes the best shoes he can. And so like that's our job as Christians who are also artists. This goes along again with what Amy said in the last episode. It's not our job to send the most Christian message we can. It's just to send the truest and best message we can and create the truest and best piece of art that we can.
Mm-hmm.
guys didn't sound too enthusiastic about Christian art and things like that.
Oh no, we weren't. There was so much more to be said, honestly.
Yeah.
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 That Dragon Cancer, I just listened to or re-listened to a podcast about it. If you don't, for those who don't know, it's That Dragon Cancer is this video game made by these. It tells the story of this family, Ryan and Amy Green, and their son, Joel, who was diagnosed with cancer at an early age, and he ultimately died from it. But the whole story, it's really beautiful. I mean, it's sort of a walking simulator, but the way it handles all the issues, the pain and all the emotions, the grief that goes into, or that comes from rather, having a child with cancer, it was just amazing how they did it. Because they themselves have been through it, and they included very Christian themes in it. Both of them are believers. They were telling Joel's story, their son's story, and people. I mean, they had a documentary shot about the making of the game, and when they would be talking to people, non-believers about it, they ask like, "Do you have any issue with this including spiritual themes?" And they're like, "No. Why would we care?" One of my teachers once said, like, people like having spiritual conversations, but they don't like getting preached at, and I think that's pretty true.
Yeah, you're being honest with it and not preachy.
Yeah.
Video games are really cool. They're like, specifically because, I don't know. Okay, so like we talk about giving like an audience a choice, when we're giving them a message and giving them things to think about. And I think that video games are really neat because they're all about choice. More realistic games usually are games, when you say, oh, this game's so realistic, it's a game that gives you more choices. And that's video games are all about choice. So I think it's a great platform for these really heavier discussions and experiences, specifically with something like That Dragon Cancer, which is something it's a very visual game, but it also has a very heavy message. So and it lets people experience that. So there you go. There's another art form for your video games, which we haven't even really gotten to talk about much, but.
Yeah, it's a thing that video games like to do nowadays is teach you the concept of like your choices matter. And a lot of video games try to do that and they don't, but the Stanley Parable was one of those video games where your choices actually matter and all these little options you have, like they are commented on by the narrator and they change the course of the game. And I don't know, I think that's one of the few games that actually drove it home to the player that your choices matter and things you do change the outcome. Even little things.
You, in your bio, you mentioned that you were on a panel, Scott, that talked about how video games can actually help students become better students. And we've been talking about video games as an art form, and I think they're a really important art form. How did you come to the conclusion that video games can actually improve our lives, or students' lives in particular? What was that discussion like?
Okay, so one answer, I kind of had to come up with answers, but one answer I gave is like prioritizing. One student asked, like, how do you, I forget her question exactly, but my answer was prioritizing. And I gave the illustration of main quests and side quests in video games. First of all, what is your main quest in life? Because that's the purpose, that's what's driving in life. But you have side quests, you have other things that you could do. And in video games, you have the main quest. Let's take Skyrim for an example. Like, you can do the main quest and you can get done with the story, and that'll be fine. But if you don't do any side quests, you'll be missing out on a bunch of the story. And on the other side, if you only do side quests, you'll end up like 1,000 useless swords and like urns or something like that. So you don't just go and play. You don't just go to every social event. You can't do everything in real life. You have to choose something that is your main quest. Or so you have to balance between, well, what am I going to focus my life on? What am I going to put my time into? Is it going to be less important things, or is it going to be the bigger thing?
I love these video game analogies. George brought up a really cool analogy of how, like when artists or even anyone in general, like when they fail, it's like in a video game when you lose a battle, but you still get XP in the end. I just think that analogy is really neat, but that's definitely helpful. And that's one way that like a video game or a piece of art is like actually helpful. And maybe that's part of the purpose of art. It actually, or at least the purpose of good art, is to help somebody in some way. I know it's really broad, but like it's something very practical. Like it's fun to play video games, but if there's that influence of, in your brain something is working where you're learning to prioritize, like I think that's kind of like a noble cause for art, for video games at least.
I keep thinking now, because you say good art instead of just art, and it's weird to think of because it can be made to seem like this really sacred concept, and it's weird to hear you say good art because in my head I'm just like, well, can we even call bad art art? And it's just more making me reflect on what I consider art to be and making me realize that maybe I need to take the concept of art in my mind down a peg from being this incredible sacred concept that always has to be a good and true thing.
Yeah.
Well, I always think of music because I have the weirdest taste in music. Super eclectic. I'll listen to like, oh gosh, I could pretty much listen to anything, but a lot of like the stuff that would inspire me, people think is total like trash, and I might even admit like at some point that it's like garbage, but there's still value in it. So that's why I'm using kind of this scale of bad art to good art, because you have someone like we were talking about the artist before, I don't remember who it was, who just threw a toilet on the wall and said this is art, and like guess what? It's sitting in a museum, and there are people, believe it or not, who are finding value in that. So I wouldn't maybe call that good art necessarily, in my opinion, but I think there is a scale probably of bad art to good art, and maybe that's a little easier to find as opposed to like what isn't art to what is art, because in the end, mostly everything, even if you consider, nature designed, by God, almost anything is design, and for me as a graphic designer, I consider design to be a very big part of art. So art is everywhere. It's harder to say what's not arts. Maybe we could talk instead have the discussion about what is bad art or what is good art. I think that's probably an easier discussion to have, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's an interesting concept, and it also has to do with the idea of like beauty is in the eye of the beholder too, because when you talk about your taste in music, like something, because I have a weird taste in music too, and something that I really love, like I remember I've shown music from my favorite bands to my dad, and he totally ridicules it and thinks it's so bad and weird, and it's just like he thinks that's bad art, and I think it's amazing art. So then what is kind of the standard that we're measuring art against, I think, is also something to think about.
Yeah, it depends on what your goal is. I mean, I would like to say there's like an objective measure of beauty and of art. It's difficult to pick which ones are part of that objective standard. It's impossible to evaluate something without a goal. Like you can't say how am I doing at basketball without having a basket or any points. What's the point? Were you just supposed to stand here on the field or whatever? And someone mentioned Vincent van Gogh in a previous episode. And art used to be like, oh, let's represent nature as closely as we can. And in that case, okay, you got the standard right there. You have nature. Does your painting look like a tree? Okay, there you go. But when like Van Gogh, when you have Impressionism come, like, is it more about how it feels, how it strikes you, how you perceive it yourself? And in that sense, okay, you're accomplishing your goal. Van Gogh accomplished his goal. It's accomplishing his goal. It's showing how he's struck by nature.
And it's interesting with Van Gogh because since he was pulling away from that, the realism, now he made his art, I think, a lot less accessible to everyone else because not everyone saw the world in the same way that he saw the world. And not everyone had the same goal as him. People weren't looking at it and saying, oh, that's exactly how you see the world. Great job. Like everyone was like, no, I don't see the world like that. So it's it's important to have, people didn't have the same goal, and that's probably why he like never sold a painting ever, because people just weren't on the same track as him. Yeah, I like how you mentioned that to have the goal of like painting something realistically is like a nice standard, which is why I brought up before kind of looking at nature maybe as part of like the beauty or the intricacy of nature as part of like maybe that standard, because I believe that nature is the ultimate designed thing. We can look at nature as kind of the standard, and maybe I was thinking of maybe like that as like a place to start for that standard. Yeah. Scott, so there are some art naysayers. We brought this up a little bit before we even started recording. Usually we're our own worst enemies, but there's a little bit of a battle with society too, where people say like, art is just fun, which of course is not true. Or even if the artist thinks that it's hard work, people would say like there are nobler things that we can be accomplishing, like becoming a lawyer, or becoming a doctor, or becoming a politician, if you think that's a noble thing. But take us back, Scott, to a more ancient art naysayer.
Back in the day.
Back in the day, because when it comes to art, from what I've read, there was a certain dude who was kind of a stick in the mud, and he thought that art was dangerous in some ways. Can you talk about him a little bit?
Well, Plato, a philosopher extraordinaire, student of Socrates, and actually teacher of Aristotle. If you've ever had, a time when you think something your professor said is just like completely wrong. I guess in that case, this is Aristotle. Plato, so his whole thing is about truth. He wants to get at truth. He wants everyone to get truth. Like, if you're getting at truth, you're getting at good things, you're going to have a good society, but you're going to be a better person. For him, he actually he admires Homer, but as much as he loves poetry, he thinks that poetry and the arts are leading people away from the truth, because he had this whole idea of forms, and it literally isn't an abstract idea. So, okay, the way he explains it is, maybe you remember in Philosophy 101, with the allegory of the cave. So picture this. You're in a cave, and you are facing the back of the cave. It's dark. You're chained. You can't look to the right or to the left. You can't get up. You can't move. And you're just looking at the back of this cave. There's a light from behind you. There's a fire from behind you. And there are figures going in front of it and projecting shadows on the end of the back of the cave. And people are just speculating what these things are. And they're like, what is this? They're giving their ideas. They're saying, this is a man, this tree, whatever. But then along comes this one guy. One guy gets free, and he gets out of the cave, and he walks out, and he sees the sun. And his eyes hurt, and it's hard for his eyes to adjust, but he's seeing the sun. And so he comes back, having taken in, the landscape or whatever, and he goes to the people there, and they think he's crazy, and they despise him, they ridicule him, think he's crazy, but nevertheless, he's seen the light, he's seen truth. So he thinks that, like, what we see, what the material world is actually less real than these ideas called forms. So take a tree or something like that, or a chair. The chair in front of you, all the chairs we're sitting on, that is less real than this form, capital C, chair. It's
like the idea of chair.
Yeah, the idea of a chair.
The original idea.
Mm-hmm.
My professor gave this fantastic example. Like, even if you destroy all the chairs in the world, and you're just like, yeah, I've destroyed all the chairs, this little child will come up and like draw a picture of a chair or something, or like put some things together, and it's like, I made a chair. I'll never destroy a chair. I wish all philosophy professors could be like him. So capital C, chair, is more real than the chair you're sitting on. But then, say you draw a picture of a chair, that's even less real than a chair that you're sitting on, because it's a copy of a form. So when you with art, that's easy, because you draw a picture of a tree that's not actually a tree. It's missing a whole lot. It's 2D, it's it's not actually made of wood, or with writing, with literature. Carly, when you write a story, if you write a story about a carpenter, I'm going to guess that you're not actually a carpenter. You don't know everything that goes into being a carpenter. So you can describe something you made, maybe you can describe some of the process, but you don't know everything that goes into it. So Plato thinks that, like, in a way, you're kind of lying to people because they may think that you know what you're talking about, when in reality you may not. Apparently, the concept of research for a plot didn't occur to Plato, but
That's the idea of, I think it's mimesis, so basically Plato thought art was bad because it's all lies and it promotes negative emotions in people, because Plato basically thought that to be emotional was a bad thing, whereas he prioritized reason, and he basically thought that reason had no place in art and art was all lies and not truth. But then there's Aristotle, who was kind of different. Basically what I got out of the whole Aristotle Plato fight was just that Plato thought like truth and reason were better than any kind of entertainment art could provide, and Aristotle basically thought that no, the emotion and the pleasure of viewing art can be related to moral lessons, and so in that it's worthwhile, whereas Plato just wanted to look at art from the point of view of ethics and philosophy, and so he found it lacking, but he didn't look at art on its own merits.
Yeah, so like I said, if you've ever had a moment where you just think your professor is totally wrong, yes, this is Aristotle saying that to Plato.
Or like a battle of the Iron Cage gladiators for philosophers or something. I don't know. That's how I'm picturing it.
That would make philosophy so much more exciting, man. Philosophical dialogue to the death. I have the high ground.
Plato.
So Aristotle thought that if you set up situations like with a play, you identify with the characters, you get to know them, get attached to them, and you can sort of relate to them in their situation. He thinks that plays should be covering something that could happen, so you can relate to it. You can relate to that character, and you can go through the challenge with them, whatever the challenge is. He favored tragedies. He thought tragedy was so much better than comedy. So think of any sad movie, any movie that has great challenges, great pain to the main character. I think always with Jake, I think of K-dramas because I know he watches them.
Do I have to edit that out?
I don't know exactly how they go down, but
this guy sounds like he was totally emo, by the way. I'm just saying.
Aristotle.
I think we'd get along.
Because he thinks tragedies are good?
Yeah. Yep.
I think we would get along too. I mean, my favorite book is literally titled The Miserable.
Yeah.
So
I think we could all party. Sorry, Scott. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So catharsis. So when you go through the whatever the trial is, like say it's with that dragon cancer, you've experienced the loss the family has experienced. You can know it in some small part, and once you get through it, you've had your good cry, you've worked through it, you can process through it, and you feel like you've been purged. Katharos is the word for pure, for clean. Catharsis, you're cleaning, you're purging these bad emotions, you're getting through it, and you feel better because of it. You can also be being taught a lesson with it. Either you try to be a virtuous person, you be a virtuous person, whether that be in relation to the state, in relation to the gods, the Greek pantheon at the time. So yeah, he definitely thought that there was a purpose to art and that it can be used definitely for good.
He thought it was like emotional boot camp, kind of, where it's like where you're going and you're experiencing these emotions, and it feels good to kind of like have resolution to the anger and sadness, whatever's going on in the actual play, and then maybe you're better prepared to deal with them in the real world. Is that kind of what he was getting at, or was it more just about the feeling of actually getting it out of your system?
I think it was both. It was the feelings, and it was the learning and trying to apply it, and yeah.
Okay, so there seems to be a little bit in this discussion about purpose of art, something kind of like I mentioned before about how there's like some sort of like practical element and maybe that element varies, but like, so he wanted, people to get ready for the real world, and the real world, prepare their emotions, prepare what they're going to go through, and something like that dragon cancer helped the family of the child who died, kind of work through those emotions as well. It was for them, but it was also for an audience who might want to prepare for those things as well. Maybe that's part of the that purpose discussion is this kind of practical element of preparing people, making them feel a certain way so that they'll be more ready for it when they actually have to feel it.
Yeah, I think there's a balance between the two guys, because I know that if you, I know in my life, I sort of have like what I've called Mitty syndrome. If you know the story, The Secret Life of Sir Walter Mitty.
Mm-hmm.
I've never actually read it. I just know that he's a guy who daydreams a whole lot, and I also think of another character, Tom from The Glass Menagerie, who's so he's just has this insatiable wanderlust, and he just fills his mind with. He goes to movies, he goes to magic shows or things like that because he hates facing the reality of living with his sort of shut-in sister and his mom. And so and you can also think of Don Quixote too. He loves knight stories so much that he just like he thinks he is a knight when he's not. And that just changes the way he views the world. And I think that Plato was getting on something that it does lead you away from the truth somewhat. It gets you, if you go too far into it, you're gonna
end up battling windmills like Don Quixote.
Yeah,
which is not a good thing. Yeah, art can be an escape, but that's probably the other extreme, and that's definitely not like always a good thing. It can help us cope, but take that to the extreme, and like I said, you're gonna be trying to take down windmills, which is not good.
And you'll be totally cut off from reality. I think art at its best helps us deal with reality and helps us work through reality and be kind of our best selves in our realities. But art at its worst takes us out of reality totally. And I think that's something also on the subject of video games that, I don't know, can be thrown into the mix, because I know people who totally think that video games are a total waste of time and they just distract you and they're like these mindless things that don't matter. And, there's virtual reality and that's a whole big thing. But then there are other video games like that Dragon Cancer that we've talked about and others that help you cope with negative emotions and situations in reality. And because they're immersive, you can kind of work through the situations in those games, and they teach you things about how to work through the situations in your own reality, in actual reality.
Yeah, and then on the other side of that again is you have those gamers who like totally lose themselves in video gaming. And I don't mean to rag just on gaming. I'm sure there's other, people get obsessed with anything, or any, kinds of different media, but specifically with gaming, because I think probably it is, a more visible problem, but they're trying to escape, and they really are trying to get away from reality, which is dangerous.
Just like we were saying, Don Quixote. You can do it with books, you can do it with movies, you can do it with poetry, you can do it with paintings, anything. Who was it? I forget, 2 episodes ago?
Tori,
yeah. Oh yeah, she said something like how you would, how with storytelling you would learn things you otherwise wouldn't learn,
Mm-hmm.
like just people telling you that. Yeah, so I got really excited when I heard that, because that immediately made me think of this concept called indirect communication, which is made by this guy Soren Kierkegaard. He's this Danish guy. I really like Kierkegaard, so I felt like I had to mention this because it fits so well.
I should have known you were going to bring him in at some point. Like, I don't know why one of my questions didn't have him in there.
There's always some way.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so he had this idea, like how there's direct communication, then there's indirect communication. Direct communication is you're telling someone, be a good person. Indirect communication is you tell a story and you have to work through the issue yourself. You have to untie this dialectical knot, is the term he liked to use, if you want to use fancy terms. Storytelling is a great way to do that.
Cool. So, after this long conversation about art and purpose, even though you're not an artist, or what you would call an artist, Scott, what advice would you give to an artist, an author or a songwriter or anyone who feels that they've lost their purpose?
Actually, I'm going to mention Kierkegaard again, because when he was a young guy, he was writing his journals, and he was like, I have to find the thing that I'm willing to live and die by, something that I'm going to, my purpose for life. And ultimately, I mean, he found it in Jesus first, but he had this whole project of authorship. He had an interesting way of writing things, like he would use pseudonyms and things like that. But the point is that he said, like, I have to find something that I'm going to live and die by. And to go back to like not being able to evaluate things without a goal, if you feel like you've lost your purpose, you're like you're not going to be able to evaluate how you're doing. And I mentioned this before, but I think that how you answer this question really is going to depend on how you answer like the big questions of life, like where are we from? Is there a God? Because those big questions have big implications, and they show up in a lot of different little ways. If you're just doing art just because you like it, and you feel like you've lost your purpose, there's more to it. You kind of want more than just, I like art, I like doing it. I'm glad you like doing it. I think you should like doing it. But the purpose, I don't think, is just going to be, I think there has to be something, the thing you're willing to live and die by has to be worth it. And for me, it's Jesus in my philosophical and religious studies, and talking to people about deep concepts and stuff like that, whether it be stuff we talked about today or other things. So that's where I get my purpose from. I can always come back to that. So I would encourage people to try to wrestle with those questions. You may need to do research. It may take a lot of thinking, a lot of struggling, a lot of wrestling, but it is well worth it. And I would be happy to talk to anyone if they wanted to email me about it. I'll try to do my best.
Thank you, Scott, for getting philosophical with us.
Thank you.
I'm glad that nothing went over my head, because usually I didn't even need you to draw anything on a napkin or anything for me. I totally got everything, which is cool. Like I said before, I know that this is a really broad discussion. It's a very big theme. And our goal was just to bring that topic of purpose to light a little bit more. And I think we definitely accomplished that.
If you'd like to read Scott's bio, you can find it on our Tumblr page at fablebreakers.tumblr.com/guests. And you'll also be able to find some more info on our other guests there. If you have any questions for Scott, you can email him directly at LetterstoaForeignLand@outlook.com or ask away on our Tumblr page.
And that'll do it for this week's episode. If you're into busting up more fables, then you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on Tumblr, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, all at Fablebreakers. I'm your host, Jake Romano.
And I'm Carly Racklin, and you've been listening to Fablebreakers.
Made a chair. I'll never destroy a chair.